Next, from the state capitol, a bipartisan committee is presented findings from the Office of the Auditor General into allegations of fraudulent spending that took place within Governor Quinn's now-defunct Neighborhood Recovery Initiative program. This runs about 1 hour and 10 minutes.
Our audit today is the performance audit of the state monies provided to the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority for the Neighborhood Recovery Act. General Holland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. House Resolution number 1110 directed my office to conduct a performance audit of the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority's use of monies provided for the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative in fiscal years 2011 and 2012. Now, before Mr. Schlauch provides our presentation on the audit's findings, I would like to address a few areas of concern. The first pertains to an issue which was touched upon in the performance audit and was the subject of a finding in our compliance examination of the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority. That issue was Illinois Violence Prevention Authority's transfer of appropriated funds to a non-appropriated fund prior to the end of the year. These funds were then expended in subsequent fiscal years. Now let me begin at the beginning. For fiscal year 2011, the Governor's Office received a lump sum GRF appropriation of $2.23 billion and $1.23 billion. Those appropriations are up there on the slide. And these funds were to be directed to state agencies at the Governor's discretion for human services programs, awards, grants, and other operational expenses. Other than that the money was appropriated to pay fiscal year 2011 obligations, these lump sum GRF appropriations had virtually no limitations. Of the lump sums, the Governor's Office transferred a total of $92.3 million in fiscal year 11 to the Violence Prevention Authority pursuant to 3 interagency agreements. Now, each of these interagency agreements specifically provided that the transferred monies may be expended, quote, from the effective date of the interagency agreement through the end of the fiscal year 11 lapse period, unquote. Next, the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority deposited $91 million of the transferred funds into a non-appropriated account. 82% of the NRI's program funding, which is $44.5 million of the total $54.5 million, came from the Governor's fiscal year 11 lump sum appropriations. Now, at the end of the fiscal year 11 lapse period, $66 million of the $92.35 million had not been dispersed by the Violence Prevention Authority. Most of this $66 million was carried over for expenditure in fiscal years 2012 and beyond. Now comes the issue. According to the Criminal Justice Information Authority, the transfer of the appropriated funds, of the appropriated monies from the General Revenue Fund to the non-appropriated Special Project Fund constituted spending for the purposes of the fiscal year limitation. Now, the Criminal Justice Information Authority further argues that once monies from the fiscal year 11 appropriation were deposited into the non-appropriated fund, they could be used without regard to any fiscal year limitations. We concluded that such a practice violates the State Finance Act and, more importantly, effectively negates the General Assembly's constitutional power to control appropriations. Consider this, if you will. If implemented across all of state government, agencies would no longer lapse unused funds at the end of the year. Rather, they would simply transfer these unused funds to a non-appropriated account for use next year, 2 years down the road, maybe 10 years from now, thereby nullifying the appropriation controls set by the General Assembly. We do not believe the mere movement of appropriated funds to a non-appropriated fund constitutes an expenditure and thereby voids fiscal year limitations. Now, as we begin our review of the audit itself, I would like the Commission members to keep 3 things in mind. First, you will hear discussions about reviewing expenditure documentation, something we feel is a basic responsibility of any agency charged with the oversight of any grant or contract. In the case of this audit, the first time that state personnel went on site to review the support for expenditure of NRI funds at 21 community agencies was when my auditors visited the providers during the summer of 2013. Now, relying on post-auditors to review expenditure support is not an effective system of internal controls by agency management. Second, there's been much written and discussed about how the program was hastily implemented. This conclusion is drawn in part from the words found on pages 29 through 31 of the report. These words document the frustration of the providers themselves. And in the end, I sympathize with those well-meaning providers who suffered from a lack of guidance, impossible timeframes, and changing requirements. Third, as some of you have noted, this audit took a little longer than is the ordinary. This can be attributed to a number of factors. Dealing with multiple agencies, one of which was abolished. The odd time period for which the program operated, October to October, and not the traditional fiscal year time period. The significant amount of time spent simply attempting to determine if documentation in fact existed, which we now know in many cases did not. Conducting our on-site testing, something that the Violence Prevention Authority never did. And finally, as we always do, we gave the agency sufficient time to review and understand our representations of the facts presented. Despite having 3 months to review and correct any of our work, CJA responded to many of the audit finding recommendations by stating, quote, "The Criminal Justice Information Authority notes that certain assertions of fact, implications, and conclusions contained in the audit report are not sufficient to fully describe and give context to the subject matter of the findings." Today, I look forward to hearing what those assertions might be, and we're prepared to address each individually. Now, in closing, I would like to mention the House Resolution 888 was adopted on April 7th, 2014, directing my office to conduct a performance audit of state monies provided by or through the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority to community-based violence prevention programs and after-school programs and the Chicago Area Project under contracts or grant agreements in fiscal years 2013 and 2014. Now, although fiscal year 2014 has not yet ended, and final records for the fiscal year will not be available until sometime in late summer or early fall, my office has already commenced this audit. With that, I will turn this over to Mr. Schlock for the details on the audit, but before I do that, I'd like to introduce Mike Maziarz, who was the audit manager on this particular engagement and did most of the work.
Thank you, Mr. Holland. The Neighborhood Recovery Initiative was a program designed to reduce the risk factors associated with violence in 23 communities in Cook County. In August of 2010, the Governor's Office gave the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority the responsibility to develop a framework for the program, as well as to administer and oversee the program. In each of the 23 communities, IVPA contracted with a lead agency, which was responsible for managing the NRI program in their community. This map highlights those communities that were selected. The ones that are in the light yellow were the ones that were selected for the NRI program. For a better visual of that map, it appears on page 14 of the audit report. The 23 lead agencies, in turn, contracted with 99 coordinating partners and 120 providing partners to provide NRI services. IVPA received $54.55 million for years 1 and 2 of the NRI program. As Mr. Holland mentioned, $44.55 million came from the Governor's discretionary appropriations in fiscal year 2011, and $10 million were general revenue funds appropriated in fiscal year 12. The monies were used to fund the 4 major NRI program components. The first was Mentoring Plus Jobs, and that was to provide youth with part-time jobs, mentoring, and social emotional skills and support. The second was Parent Leadership, which provided parents with skills that would enable them to be community leaders, educators, and mentors for other parents. The third was School-Based Counseling, funding to provide school-based early intervention and trauma-informed counseling service for students. And fourth, Reentry, provide reentry services for youth and young adults returning to the community from youth and adult correctional facilities. Now, during the audit, Public Act 97-1151 was signed into law in January 2013, which transferred staff, functions, and funds from the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority to the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. CJA assumed responsibility for NRI for the year 3 of the program. Now, the overall conclusion that we reached in the audit report was that we found pervasive deficiencies in IVPA's planning, implementation, and management of the NRI program. Turning first to planning, we concluded that the NRI program was hastily implemented, which limited the time IVPA had to adequately plan for and implement the program. On August 13, 2010, the governor attended a violence prevention conclave in Roseland, where ministers requested he declare a state of emergency on the current violence problem. 5 days later, on August 18th, IVPA was informed that the governor's office wanted to invest at least $20 million in violence prevention and was directed to develop a framework for the NRI program. Less than 2 months later, on October 6, 2010, the governor announced the NRI program, and the program had increased to a cost of $50 million for the Chicago communities. Now, the lack of adequate planning was evidenced in comments made by providing agencies in their quarterly reports to IVPA. For example, the Safer Foundation officials reported that, quote, grant timeline has been changed repeatedly due to external factors. Handout materials were often unavailable. Speakers were knowledgeable and engaging, but several made it clear that they had been brought into the NRI program at the last minute and were unable to answer specific questions about the expectations of the grant. Now, this was in the Safer Foundation's first quarterly report, which was filed 8 months after the NRI program began. The Provider Leiden Council for Community Action officials reported, quote, as of June 20th, 2011, we have not received outreach materials. This was 80 days after the contract began and 72 days before the end of the Year 1 contract. Youth guidance officials in their Year 1 closeout report described the barriers that they encountered. Quote, the greatest challenge has been not being able to provide clinical services in schools despite the great need for these services because we do not have a returned and executed contract with the Chicago Public Schools as of yet. This report was submitted December 12, 2011, which was 21 days after the contract for Year 1 NRI services ended. And additional agencies' comments on planning and implementation problems with the NRI program can be found throughout the report, for example, on pages 29, 30, 31, 59, 84, 85, and 88. Turning to the selection of the communities, according to the former IVPA director, IVPA selected the communities to be served by NRI based on an analysis performed by the Department of Human Services for the Safety Networks program. However, neither IVPA or DHS could locate the analysis used, nor could IVPA provide any other documentation to auditors showing how Chicago communities were selected to participate in NRI. Additionally, the communities that were selected for NRI were not all the most violent in terms of crime in the Chicago area. Now, House Resolution 1110 asked us to examine whether communities with similar crime rates were excluded from the NRI program. Our comparison of NRI communities to the violent crime totals published by the Chicago Police Department found 7 Chicago neighborhoods that were among the 20 most violent neighborhoods that did not receive NRI funding. This exhibit appears in the audit report, and highlighted in yellow are the 7 communities out of the top 20 that did not receive any NRI funding. In Year 3 of NRI, another Chicago community, Hermosa, was added to the NRI program. This community ranked 48th in violent crime over the years 2005 to 2010. Rather than using a competitive request for proposal process that may have gathered multiple and interested qualified parties, IVPA sought recommendations from non-state agency personnel, Chicago aldermen, for organizations to serve as lead agencies for the NRI program. IVPA failed to conduct its due diligence to document the decisions related to the selection of lead agencies were free from any conflict of interest, the appearance of conflict of interest, or that agencies selected were the best entities to provide the needed services. While IVPA issued an RFP for a Governor's Neighborhood Recovery Plan on September 8, 2010, to select agencies to administer the program, the RFP was only sent to those agencies recommended by aldermen 5 days earlier. Furthermore, our review of IVPA's scoring of the RFP submissions identified numerous deficiencies, including evaluation forms with inconsistent criteria, unscored criteria, changed scoring, and undated evaluations. IVPA had a budgeted headcount of 11 full-time equivalent positions for fiscal year 2011. During that fiscal year, the governor transferred over $92 million from his discretionary appropriation to IVPA for NRI and other special grant programs. Many of the IVPA staff responsible for critical NRI program functions, such as monitoring and administration, were hired between 91 and 406 days after the NRI program was announced by the governor in October of 2010. We found that IVPA failed to timely approve contracts for NRI services with community partners. 40% of the contracts were approved by IVPA after the contract was executed by the lead and community partners. IVPA also allowed community partners to work on NRI activities prior to the execution of the contractual agreement. Turning to financial controls, IVPA established two important financial reporting mechanisms, which, if implemented correctly, would have provided IVPA with critical information to monitor community agencies' spending of grant funds. The first were annual budgets, which laid out how the agencies were planning on spending their funds, and the second were quarterly reports, which showed how the funds were actually spent. Our review concluded that both mechanisms were ineffectively implemented by many of the community agencies and not effectively monitored by IVPA. This significantly reduced their usefulness as an IVPA management control. For example, budgets were revised after year end. After year one of the NRI program ended, IVPA continued to amend budgets for year one funds. For example, the lead agency for Pilsen Little Village Community had 3 budget changes to its year one budget after the end of year one. The last being on September 21, 2012, 342 days after year one was completed, and just a month before the end of year two. We found that quarterly reports were submitted late and were inaccurate. Quarterly reports serve two purposes for the NRI program. First, as a monitoring mechanism for the lead agencies and IVPA, and second, as a mechanism to trigger the next payment to the providing agency. Both NRI lead agencies and community partners failed to timely submit quarterly progress reports. In addition, even though agencies certified that all the information in this report is accurate, agencies made multiple revisions to their quarterly reports. We also found that reallocations were unapproved by IVPA. IVPA failed to enforce contractual provisions which required IVPA approval before agencies could reallocate their funds to other expense lines. Our review of community files identified 278 reallocations totaling over $1 million, of which 70% lacked documentation to show that IVPA had approved the reallocation. Our review of quarterly reports found that community partners did not maintain the number of staff required by their contracts with IVPA. For example, Mentoring Plus Jobs providers were to hire 80 youth in each community. We found that the average number of youth employed was only 66 per period. Agencies only met the staffing requirement 21% of the time. We found no documentation to show that IVPA took the steps necessary to correct these staffing deficiencies. IVPA also failed to enforce contractual provisions regarding the maintenance of timesheets for Mentoring Plus Jobs and parent leadership staff. At 23 randomly selected NRI agencies, we found 30% of the agencies did maintain timesheets for their staff. 35% did not maintain timesheets. 22 had partial support, and 13% were either not tested due to the agencies went out of business or they had no salary charges to the NRI program. Lead agencies were contractually required to notify IVPA within 10 business days of personnel substitutions, additions, or subtractions. Additionally, IVPA developed the quarterly fiscal reporting forms, which included a personnel expenses detail chart for lead agencies to list the individuals' names, salary, and fringe amounts charged to the grant. There were question payments of almost $500,000 for instances where an individual appeared on the personnel detail chart that had not been identified in the contract with IVPA or had not been reported as hired on previous quarterly reports. Lead agencies also failed to provide the personnel expenses detail chart. Absent this information in the quarterly reports, IVPA staff would have been unable to determine who was being paid with state grant funds. For those quarters in which the charts were not submitted for review, lead agencies charged almost $900,000 in salary and fringe benefits to state NRI grants. We found that IVPA did not monitor provider staff to ensure that the state was not paying for more than 100% of an individual's time. We identified instances where it appeared individuals were being compensated by state dollars in excess of 100% of their time. While there may be explanations as to various work arrangements, such as an employee working overtime or working hours past the regular day on additional NRI activities, the IVPA files did not contain any evidence that the exceptions noted above had been evaluated by IVPA. As Mr. Holland mentioned, IVPA delegated responsibility for fiscal monitoring of community partners to the NRI lead agencies. Only 30% of lead agencies required partners to submit support for claimed expenses on quarterly reports. This slide also appears in the audit report, and it shows those 7 communities where the lead agencies required their providing partners to maintain and submit expense documentation. There were 15 highlighted in red that were not required to maintain or submit expense report, and the last one was Woodlawn, which went out of business. We randomly sampled 23 NRI providers and reviewed the documentation on site to support the expenses charged to the NRI program. We questioned 40% of the NRI expenses at these 23 providers. In many cases, the supporting documentation supplied to the auditors by the providers, such as payroll ledgers or receipts and invoices, did not total to the amounts included on the closeout reports. In other instances, there were expenses that were not allowable based on criteria for the program developed by IVPA. IVPA utilized a process that failed to timely recover unspent NRI funds for the state. IVPA allowed unspent NRI funds from year 1 to be carried over for provider use in year 2 of the program. 82% of the providers in year 1 and 77% of the providers in year 2 did not expend all of their NRI funds. For year 2, some providers and lead agencies repaid unspent funds. However, as of January 2014, 50 agencies, both lead agencies and providing partners, had $2 million in unspent funds for NRI in year 2, which IVPA did not provide documentation to show they had collected. IVPA failed to enforce provisions of an intergovernmental grant agreement with the University of Illinois at Chicago relative to an NRI evaluation project. IVPA had not required the university to submit the deliverables outlined in the grant agreement or to follow the timeline for providing the deliverables. Furthermore, IVPA did not require the university to assess whether NRI had been effective in reducing violence in the communities in which the state funds were expended. In conclusion, the audit report contained 19 recommendations directed to the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority as the agency responsible for the continuation of the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative. The authority generally agreed with the report's recommendations. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And Jane, if you get copies of the presentations, the slides for all members as well. We're joined today by the Criminal Justice Information Authority Director, Jack Catrone. Mr. Catrone, would you join us at the table? And like you to make some opening comments and opening statements. Also introduce the ladies joining with you today.
My name is Jack Catrone. My position is Executive Director of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. With me today is Lisa Stevens, who is our General Counsel and Chief of Staff. I would like to begin by making clear that our agency, the Criminal Justice Information Authority, administers a program that is the Community Violence Prevention Program. It does not administer the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative. The audit that's being discussed this morning that the Auditor General and their staff spent so much time and effort on is an audit of NRI and of IVPA. The Auditor General's report cites many weaknesses in the planning, the implementation, and the administration and monitoring of that program. And as was just indicated in the Auditor General's presentation, made a number of recommendations, 19, and noted also that the Criminal Justice Information Authority, by and large, accepts all those as good business practices, and in fact, those recommendations are consistent with the Criminal Justice Information Authority's normal grant processes and procedures. Let us remember today that the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative no longer exists. The Illinois Violence Prevention Authority no longer exists. The Community Violence Prevention Program under CJA is a distinct program, although it does seek to address some of the same issues that the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative addressed. Under the history that CJA has developed for monitoring grants, and primarily we started out as a grant monitoring agency for federal grants, and we have a rigorous and strict grant administration and monitoring policies and procedures, and we have applied those to the Community Violence Prevention Program to the extent that we were able. CJA's actual first involvement with this funding and this program, or these types of programs, came at the time that the budget was passed for state fiscal year 13, and we were given 2 appropriations for grants to community organizations for violence prevention programs. At the same time, a line item or line items were removed from the Violence Prevention Authority's budget for the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative. Questions were then being raised in the administration and the General Assembly about the efficacy of the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative and the Violence Prevention Authority's ability to administer the program. A resolution was passed calling for this audit. At the time CJA received that funding, we began planning for administering our own grant program. However, we wanted to avail ourselves of the many existing community organizations that had formerly been part of the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative in order to use an infrastructure that had already been created rather than try to create one from scratch. However, those community agencies and organizations were then subject to our rigorous grants control procedures. In terms of the change in the design of the program from Neighborhood Recovery Initiative to the program that we administered, it's in keeping with our general preference to support programs through our grants that are evidence-based. That means that there's empirical evidence to support the efficacy of those types of programs. We found evidence to support the use of subsidized summer employment for youth with traditional employers as predicting or as increasing the chances of successful life outcomes for the participants. With the assistance of a national mentoring organization, CEJA identified 2 Cornell University professors who specialized in employment-based mentoring. And they assisted us in designing our mentoring program and training the people who would train the actual mentors, different from the Violence Prevention Authority's mentoring, which, as I understand it, the mentors primarily were acting as supervisors of teams of young people as they passed out anti-violence messages in their community. We also looked to find a program that could be used to assist parents in better parenting and would increase those protective factors that prevent their children from engaging in later criminal or violent activity. And a local partner to that organization helped us design our parent program and helped us implement that program. I will say that even though CEJA is a much larger agency than the Violence Prevention Authority, design and implementing a $20 million new program was a substantial strain on CEJA's resources, particularly its grant and research units. In early January 2013, Public Act 97-1151 became law when it was signed by the governor, dissolving the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority and transferring all of its staff, assets, rights, and duties to the Criminal Justice Information Authority. Some of the IVPA staff left state service both before and after late March 2013, when the Violence Prevention Authority staff eventually came to CEJA's offices. While managing and running the community violence prevention program subject to our authorities' standard controls and procedures, CEJA also worked to close out the old, now defunct, Neighborhood Recovery Initiative grants that remained open from the Violence Prevention Authority and NRI Year 1 and 2. I think that the Auditor General staff will indicate that we cooperated fully with them in their audit of the Violence Prevention Authority. Actually, 3 audits, a performance audits and 2 compliance audits. And CEJA's proceeded to implement, CEJA staff also was substantially taken up. I mean, our time was substantially taken up with trying to provide whatever assistance we could to the Auditor General. Since receiving the general revenue funding violence prevention appropriation, CEJA's focus in that regard has primarily been on developing the community violence prevention program, which, as I said, was a substantial undertaking, and it was really not until late 2013, in keeping with our responsibility to assist the auditor, that we became intimately familiar with many of the details of the Violence Prevention Authority's administration of the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative program. Again, CEJA and its predecessor agency has been involved in grant administration for over 30 years, and over that time our agency has developed policies and procedures that have generally been proven to be effective and have rarely caused issues in the many audits that we get both from the Auditor General and from the United States Department of Justice. I am not here this morning to try and argue with many of the findings of the Auditor General's audit report as to the Violence Prevention Authority's implementation of the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative. Failures to follow its own policies, failures to require adherence to its contracts, failure to maintain timelines, failure to maintain documentation so that later examinations could test the ability of the Violence Prevention Authority to adequately monitor the program. The Criminal Justice Information Authority has such procedures. We do maintain such documentation. The report finally made specific recommendations for CJA's administration of the Community Violence Prevention Program, and as I indicated, our response was to accept almost all of those recommendations and note that they were largely consistent with CJA's existing grant practices. And with that, I invite any questions.
Director, thank you for your opening comments. And my intent now would be to go to questions from members of the commission. And I think we'll start with comments and questions from Co-Chairman Barrickman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to understand our duty here, and I want to talk to that in a moment. But first, I want to thank General Holland and his staff. We already know that this has not been the easiest, necessarily, audit to perform, regardless of the delays, the lack in documentation, information. I think I'm likely not alone in speaking or praising the Auditor General and his team for the exceptional work that they've done. Just like always, I think we've always come to expect top-notch work, and we see nothing short of that here. The House of Representatives asked the Auditor General to conduct a performance audit and make certain determinations, as the Auditor General outlined, come from House Resolution 1110. We discussed at length at our last hearing that the Auditor General operates pursuant to the Illinois State Auditing Act, and that same statute defines a performance audit within Section 1-14. The statute plus the House Resolution 1110 determine the scope of the Auditor General's work product, and I know I am completely satisfied that he has satisfied his duties to the Legislative Audit Commission. And so again, I want to thank him for a job well done. We're also aware that there are criminal probes into this program at both the state and federal level today. And some have suggested, both at our last hearing and since, that we should not continue our pursuit due to these ongoing criminal investigations. However, I do not believe we have the luxury of simply accepting this scathing audit as evidence of business as usual in Illinois. As we discussed at our last hearing, the Legislative Audit Commission, us, we have a duty to ascertain facts, take action, and make recommendations regarding the expenditures of taxpayer dollars. Our duties are unique to those of the Auditor General, and they're unique to those who are in law enforcement. And it would be irresponsible for us to shirk our obligations to the people of Illinois. I think today's audit explains what happened with NRI. And there's been a lot of jockeying about the motives for creating this program. Some claim it was a legitimate attempt to combat violence in the city of Chicago. Others suggest it was an attempt to use $50 million, taxpayer dollars, to get out the vote in Chicago and influence the outcome of the 2010 gubernatorial election, which Pat Quinn ultimately won by a slim margin. We cannot attempt to draw conclusions to the motives that led to a program that the Auditor General says was hastily implemented and included pervasive deficiencies in its planning, implementation, and management. If taxpayer dollars were used for political purposes, I am certain we will hear more from those in law enforcement regarding those criminal activities. Our duty here is to publicly vet this taxpayer-funded program, and we simply cannot let the governor get away with this type of waste. Our meetings are held in public, which allows the public an opportunity to judge whether we are providing prudent oversight of their taxpayer dollars, and so that the public can determine whether we are properly providing the checks and balances necessary for our government to be both effective and accountable. Because of this, we must go beyond the audit's declaration of what happened. We must identify how this program was formed and functioned. The audit gives us a very good roadmap and tells us what happened with the anti-violence program, that it had little documentation explaining how the program was created, that it had no documentation explaining how the communities served were selected, that it did not target the most violent areas of Chicago, had a budget that ballooned from $20 million to $50 million literally overnight without anyone explaining why that happened. And at the end, we have no idea whether the program even worked. We must know how this waste of taxpayer dollars happened so that we can ensure taxpayers that it will not happen again. That's our duty on the Legislative Audit Commission by law. And contrary to recent claims by the governor, this program has not been abolished. It just has a new name. In fact, Mr. Catrone talked about some of the circumstances regarding the new name. This program has cost taxpayers over $100 million since 2010. And there's millions more slated for these types of grants in this year's budget. This year's budget, which we may vote on in the coming hours or days. Millions of dollars. The most recent appropriation that includes these types of grants go to yet another agency, not to CJA, not to Illinois Violence Prevention Authority, but evidently the Department of Labor is the recipient of these types of grants in our most recent budget. Department of Labor doesn't even handle these type of grants. Our duty by law is to make sure this abuse of the taxpayer dollars will end. So in that context, quite frankly, I'm a bit puzzled by Mr. Catrone's appearance here today. It's no fault of his own for being here, I presume, but I have read thousands of pages of documents, emails, the reports that the Auditor General's staff have put together, phone logs, on, and there is hardly any appearance of Mr. Catrone's name in any of those documents. And if our job is to better understand how this waste of taxpayer dollars happened, I'm not sure that Mr. Catrone is the one who can give us the answers. And from his opening testimony today, I suspect that he may believe that's true as well. So for now, I know the commission members have a number of questions. I see the hands have all risen. I'm going to simply sit back and listen and hear those questions of my colleagues and maybe comment later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's our intent now to go to questions, and for Executive Director Catrone and Lisa Stevens, I also will have some closing comments. I will start the questioning first with Representative Sandak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Catrone, welcome, and thank you for attending today's hearing. I was struck by a comment you made, and it's actually now out of order. Your current project, the Community Violence Prevention Program, you heard Co-Chairman Berrickman say it's another variation of NRI. You may take issue with that, but what struck me was a comment that you said that you're utilizing some of the infrastructure of NRI in your endeavors going forward. You did make the use of the word efficacy, meaning you wanted to be using assets in an efficient manner. What vetting process or what care did you take, your agency take, in making sure the infrastructure borrowed and or utilized by the Community Violence Prevention Program is good and is able to do what your program, I'm sure, intends to accomplish in a way very different than what happened with NRI?
Representative, I will say that when the program first came to us, there had been I believe, 3 lead agencies that had been involved in the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative, and the information that was provided to us was that they were either, I believe one was defunct, and a couple were underperforming. We terminated those agencies, and I'll say that as with any of our grants, we try to make a continuing evaluation of the ability of our grantees to perform, to actually implement the programs for which we provide grants. Since receiving this program, we've identified other agencies that we did not feel were adequately performing, found other agencies to replace those. So it's a continuing process. It's not, the idea was, again, we recognize that these and other some sort of surrounding communities had issues that could be addressed with grants, and there was already a set of collaborations among community organizations. And again, for us to try and rebuild such a structure from scratch would have taken probably the entire first state fiscal year.
Very good, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later, because as you know, having read the audit, the efficacy of NRI was questioned almost from the get-go, given it was put together rather hastily, I think the term was used, and the timeline is truncated, to be polite. And so I just wondered why there was any belief that any infrastructure that came out of NRI had any integrity in your mind, rather than doing it from scratch, given where we are with this audit.
I think I would respond to that with this. I mean, the people at IVPA that designed the program that they implemented, the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative, tried to identify certain factors at the community level and at the individual level that are contributors to crime and violence. They chose a particular model, which was basically social messaging, to try and deal with crime and violence in those communities. Because of our core competency in criminal justice, criminology, research, we opted to use a different types of programs to address those factors. But I do want to point out that just, for example, providing summer youth with jobs, keeping them occupied, showing them that that there are other ways to earn a living other than engaging in criminal activity, even under NRI's model, did exhibit some success. I mean, there were over 3,000 young people that were given jobs. There were probably roughly the same number of adults that were provided jobs. And we know from our research that unemployment and poverty are a large contributor to crime and criminal activity. So the ideas perhaps weren't so bad. I think it was the execution where it was lacking.
I don't think anyone will argue with the ideas about trying to prevent violence in the city of Chicago and the surrounding areas. The methodology employed in this program, how it came to formation, and that's actually a great transition, because that's what I want to ask you about, to the extent you have knowledge about how NRI was put together. I went through some documents. I went and saw some of the original documents that were that backstopped this audit, and some of the emails particularly indicated to me that it started in August of 2010, and then by October of 2010 we had a program that was funded almost to $50 million. I understand that you were with CJA at the time, but the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority was the program overseer, the administrator. Were you a board member of that organization at that time?
I was on the board. I was not actively participating in IVPA.
Tell me about the structure of IVPA. as you understood it at the time? I know it no longer exists, but what was the structure of that organization in August of 2010?
It was governed by a board that was co-chaired by the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Department of Human Services. It had a number of state agency and public members that were on the governing board. IVPA had, to my understanding, approximately 11 employees at the time, a director, a deputy director, and within its types of grants, there were what we would call grant monitors and program supervisors for some of the types of grants. They also had fiscal and supporting staff.
Going back to the board, so there were two co-chairs,
Yes.
the Attorney General for the state of Illinois and the director of what department?
I believe it was the Secretary of the Department of Human Services.
Okay, and how many board members were on IVPA, do you know?
You know what? I don't want to answer that question because my memory is not adequate to give you an
It's okay,
accurate
yeah,
answer.
I don't want guesses or...
Why don't we correct who the co-chairmen were? I believe when we reviewed the documentation, I think it was the director of the Department of Public Health, maybe?
I misspoke.
Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah, very good, thank you.
I shouldn't put more burdens on Secretary
And you know this,
Sadler.
Mr. Catrone, with your training, if you don't remember something, that's a perfectly acceptable answer.
Yes.
But I'm interested in that structure, though. At or around the time of August of 2010, were there board meetings with respect to the implementation of NRI?
I was not present during any board meetings. I would, from time to time, get notices of board meetings, but I was occupied with Criminal Justice Information Authority business. I can't really answer.
Do you remember how frequently or infrequently that board met?
My recollection is that it was quarterly meetings.
Okay, because as you know from the audit, on August 18, 2010, the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority was given responsibility by the governor to develop a framework and invest $20 million in this initiative to try and combat violence. My review of the records just a couple days later, the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority was assigned the duty of structuring NRI, and the number went from $20 million to $30 million in a couple of days. And then October, later on, the number's $50 million. Do you have any personal knowledge of how the appropriations or the intent to appropriate graduated from $20 million to $50 million in the matter of 3 months?
No.
Do you see any documentation in your endeavors as a board member with respect to how this program grew, again, in a matter of months, from $20 million idea to a $50 million program?
Again, no.
Do you know who made the decision to make this program grow to $50 million?
I was not privy to that decision process.
So you don't know?
Correct.
And I meant to ask you this, Mr. Catrone, pardon me, in preparation for today's testimony, did you talk to anyone at the governor's office?
I just confer with the governor's office on a regular basis.
Yeah, but I asked you about today's preparation for your testimony today. I know you talked to the governor's office in your endeavors, but as you sat here today in preparation for your testimony, did you talk to someone from the governor's office?
Yes.
Who?
A number of people, including the individual to whom I answer, Vivian Anderson, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety. Part of the discussions were John Schomburg, who is the governor's...
Yeah, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Usually people complain because I speak too loudly. John Schomburg, who is the governor's general counsel, individuals from the governor's public information office, individuals from the governor's office of management and budget. Frankly, there were a number of people in the room. With a gun to my head, I couldn't name them all.
Well, here, let's walk through this, Mr. Catrone, because your testimony, I heard Chairman Berkman speak to it, and I suspect your testimony will be useful, but I looked at the emails, too, and I looked at a lot of the documents, not to the extent Senator Berkman did. I didn't see your name on much. In fact, it's after-the-fact stuff. And our job, I see, as being necessary to talk to the participants. So the reason I asked you about who you talked to in preparation for your testimony, because it's important to me to find out who we need to hear from next. So let's walk through this. You said Vivian Anderson,
Yes.
John Schaumburg.
Yes.
Who else?
Brooke Anderson was part of some of the discussions, Leslie Field, but I want to say that what we were discussing, it is, and as I indicated in my opening statement, during the period of time that the audit was coming to a close, senior CJA staff, including myself, spent a great deal of time reviewing not only the auditor's PAFs, but also information from IVPA records. So it's not completely accurate to say I have no knowledge of what occurred at IVPA. I do, as a result of review of documents, speaking with certain staff.
I meant to suggest in real time as events unfolded. I have no doubt that because of your job duties in CJA that you've looked over, and obviously you've read the audit. But let's go back to, again, your testimony today, because I want to make sure I've exhausted your recollection as to whom you spoke with. Vivian Anderson, John Schaumburg, Brooke Anderson, Leslie
Fields, Grant Klinsman, Ruqayya Alakan. I'm sorry, but I don't recall the name of the person from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget.
My count is 7 people. Was this one meeting or several meetings with whom or is it telephone calls?
There were, I believe, a total of 2 meetings.
And when did these meetings occur, sir?
One last week and one yesterday.
The meeting last week, can you give me in sum and substance what was said?
It would be difficult. It's a long meeting. We discussed matters that I anticipate. Well, let me back this up, because Director Strickland supplied to us some questions that commission members had indicated they wanted to address at this hearing, and using those questions, I drafted certain responses, and it was a discussion of those drafts. So it's very difficult to try and even summarize.
Do you have those drafts still of what you submitted and what was circulated at that first meeting?
Yes, I have. Well, I have the final product.
Okay. And each individual, by the way, were all 7 people that we've just identified at this first meeting?
There were actually 11 people.
11.
Yes, but I just can't recall the names.
That's a lot of people at a meeting about a testimony before the Audit Commission. Give me what happened yesterday. Who was at the meeting yesterday?
Vivian Anderson, John Schaumburg, Leslie Fields, Grant Klinsman, Ruqayya Alakan, I believe another attorney from the Governor's General Counsel Office, Iris Shavira, I'm sorry, I forgot her last name, was participating by phone. Katie Hickey, actually she was present at the other meeting too.
Were anyone else in attendance at this meeting that wasn't part of the governor's staff or the part of the administration?
My general counsel and chief of staff was present.
Okay. Yesterday's discussion, can you give me the sum and substance of what was discussed?
Again, it was further discussion of potential responses to the questions that were tendered to us.
Mr. Catrone, I'm going to be real blunt. That's a lot of people for a meeting to talk about today's discussion. Did it strike you as odd that there were 11 people at a meeting? Forget your general counsel for a second, because that makes perfect sense. She's your staff. That's a lot of people to attend a meeting in preparation for testimony today before this commission.
It didn't strike me as particularly odd, but I'd like to say that I understood that the thrust of this meeting was going to be discussed to the extent we could what occurred during IVPA's administration of NRI, and that's really what the focus of my attendance is
Were
today.
any of the people in attendance, Vivian Anderson, John Schaumburg, Brooke Anderson, Leslie Fields, any of the other 9 or so people, were they around at or around the time the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority enacted NRI? Were they participants in NRI in any way, shape, or form?
I do not believe so, but I do not know for certain.
Was that a topic of discussion either last week or yesterday?
No.
When was IVPA disbanded?
If I recall, the effective date of the legislation was January 7th, 2013.
January 25th. Close enough, though.
I can only answer to the best of my recollection,
Understood.
which frequently is a little
Understood.
fuzzy.
Getting back to IVPA's involvement with NRI, I asked you about your involvement as a board member with IVPA, and you were clear you didn't know how the program graduated from a $20 million idea to a $50 million project that was implemented between August and October of 2010. Do you have any idea who chose to make these violence prevention grants non-competitive?
No.
In your endeavors now with CJA, under any circumstances, do you hand out grants in a non-competitive manner?
Occasionally we do. For example, if an organization comes to us with an idea for a grant addressing an area that we perceive as being one of need, and to explain we do, but I do want to make clear it's not CJA staff that makes the ultimate decision as to who or not who gets grants from the Criminal Justice Information Authority. It's actually our governing board, generally acting through its budget committee.
So there's a board there with CJA, right?
Yes.
Not unlike the board that you were on with Illinois Violence Prevention Authority. When you do a single source or non-competitive manner for grant letting, you still have vetting processes. You still have, to use your word, making sure the efficacy of the grant has integrity and is not a waste, correct?
And generally what we're looking at for the proposed program is what is the problem that it seeks to address. We look at whether or not the program that is being proposed to address the problem is either evidence-based, that there's empirical research to support it, or whether it might be considered a promising practice based on knowledge in the field. We look at the proposed cost of the program, and again, if we think it's appropriate, then we present that information to the Budget Committee ultimately for a decision. We also, when you're speaking of of letting grants without a competitive process, I will say also that there are a large number of CJA grants that are continuation grants, continuing programs
Sure.
that we've done for many years, multi-jurisdictional drug task forces and the like, and we do not expose those to a competitive process.
Mr. Catron, whether it's exposed to a competitive process or not, the criterion you developed makes perfect sense. Do you know if any of that criterion were utilized by the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority in its endeavors through NRI, making grants available to the various community groups?
Well, again, the NRI program was aimed to address some factors that are known to contribute to crime and violence. It's my understanding from the information I have that the Violence Prevention Authority chose to use social messaging to address those, and there is some empirical support from the Center.
Did you see some of the empirical support?
Our research unit did provide me with some research indicating that there was efficacy in social messaging to deal with public health problems. I will say I was unable to locate or our research unit was unable to locate any studies showing that social messaging was effective with respect to crime and violence in particular.
Again, with respect to the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority, Do you know who made the decision to make the grants not competitive and not subject to an RFP process?
No.
Do you know when that decision was made?
I don't want to state assumptions, so I'll have to answer that question, no.
In any other areas of high violence in the state of Illinois, are you aware, such as Peoria or Decatur or the Metro East area, are you aware of any other letting of grant dollars through a non-competitive process similar to what happened here with the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority through the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative?
I'm going to say no, but by my no, I'm not indicating that did not happen. I just don't know.
Understood. You're just not aware of it. The audit report shows that Chicago aldermen recommended or selected lead agencies for the program rather than RFPs. Do you know of any reports about the efficacy of that methodology revealed itself with respect to any value proposition on the use of tax dollars here with NRI?
I have to make an observation here because that was one of the areas that we did not necessarily agree with at least some of the conclusions that were contained in the Auditor General's report. The aldermen and other elected officials were invited to identify agencies that would apply to the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority to become lead agencies in this. And there are at least 3 agencies that were so identified by elected officials that were ultimately not chosen by IVPA because they did not meet the criteria. There was, IVPA did develop a selection process, did develop criteria for agencies to apply, and did review what were initially termed profiles that were submitted by the agencies. And those profiles were reviewed. Agencies were then invited to submit an application, which IVPA termed a RFP, and frankly, I thought that was a very poor choice of terminology because RFP
because there was nothing,
generally,
there was nothing RFP about it.
Well, generally RFP would connote a competitive process, which this was not.
Yes. Okay. Do you know why? Well, as a board member for the IVPA, were you aware of why your board or the governor's office did not conduct any evaluations of the partner agencies under NRI?
It's, when you say our board, you're referring to IVPA's board?
Right.
Okay. It's my understanding that staff did an evaluation by reviewing both the profiles and the applications that were submitted in response to the RFP.
And you said that did you, as a board member for IVPA, see any evaluations by IVPA staff about the propriety of these agencies?
Because of the press of other business, I was not actively involved with IVPA and its board activities at that time. So the answer is no.
Obviously, the timing of all this is subject to people's impressions and opinions. This project, from start to finish, I guess, or implementation, was a matter of months. Are you aware of any such endeavor where a project becomes, it's basically an idea in August and is all of a sudden being funded in October? Did that cause you any pause at or around the time as a board member for IVPA?
Well, in order to answer that question, I think I would be remiss if I did not try to put that in context. Although the Criminal Justice Information Authority was not part of putting the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative together because of our role as a criminal justice policy and planning agency, we are aware of the levels of crime and violence in the city of Chicago. In 2010, there were 436 homicides just in Chicago, according to CPD statistics, and countless other incidents of violent crimes and attempted violent crimes. Among those 436 homicides, 5 Chicago police officers were killed. Children as young as 8 were killed while riding their bicycles.
Mr. Catrone,
April
the
of-
policy or the initiative behind this program, I don't think you'll get anyone to argue with. But along those lines, my indication from the audit says that 7 of the top 20 Chicago neighborhoods for violence did not even receive NRI funding. So utilizing kind of that emotional component of let's fight violence where it's actually occurring. How come, to your knowledge, the monies weren't distributed in a manner that would be consistent with the message of trying to truly combat violence in the neighborhoods where it originated?
I can address what we're doing at the Criminal Justice Information Authority.
I have no doubt about
Those
that.
non-covered communities are now covered. Individuals from those communities are now receiving our services.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. But at around the time of NRI, there were a number of communities that were ignored, and they were high violence communities, that were experiencing inordinate crime levels, and yet they weren't participants in this program. Do you know why they were excluded?
Well, Representative, as you have, I've read the audit report, and IVPA indicated that its choice of communities was based on a study that was done some years earlier to initiate the Safety Networks program, I believe in 2005, a program that was housed at the Department of Human Services. We were informed, I read, again, what you read, that it was the communities that were identified there that were chosen for the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative.
Mr. Catrone, I've been taking more than my time, so I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming here, and I obviously appreciate your continued efforts under ICEJA. Just one last question. The Community Violence Prevention Program that CEJA administers, is it fair to say it's just a reconstituted NRI, or is that an unfair comment?
I'm not going to comment on whether it's fair or not. Our view of it is because we changed the nature of services that were being used to address those risk factors for crime and violence at the community level and the individual level, that it is a different program than the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Illinois Channel's coverage of the state legislature is underwritten by the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association.